Oahu Democrats welcome you to Let's Talk Story.
All right, welcome everyone. Glad you can join Region 1 for our next presentation on reapportionment. This is a hot topic that's been bandied about in the news for some time, and we thought it would be a good idea to bring together a couple of folks who've been very involved in the reapportionment process to share information about how the process works, a little bit about what they've seen in the past, what to look for this time, and how you might be involved. So I'd like to introduce Bart Dame and Becky Gardner. And Bart, if you'd here to share something?
Yeah, a little bit of background on my relationship with this. I had served for 6 years as an official observer of the election process in the county center of the Capitol. So I had a pretty good grasp of that part of the election system. And I also was one of the lead advocates for requiring all electronic voting machines in Hawaii produce a paper trail that voters could verify and could be used for audits. So to expand my understanding of the election process 10 years ago when they formed a reapportionment commission, I decided I would start attending the meetings. And I went back and I read the records from the constitutional conventions and the reports of previous commissions. And I quickly became aware that the 2011 commission was not obeying the Constitution of the state of Hawaii in their coming up with a population on which to base reapportionment. They're supposed to, under our Constitution, come up a count of the permanent resident population, excluding non-permanent residents, and then divide that population up first between the 4 counties, and then within each county into legislative districts that have relatively equal numbers of permanent residents. But they were determined to include easily identifiable non-residents, especially out-of-state students for a small amount, and a larger amount active duty military personnel and their dependents. So I went and I testified, tried to reason with them, and they proceeded anyways. And then in the course of that, my amateurish layman's mind trying to make sense of this, I met Becky Gardner, who was a staff attorney for Bob Herkes, who was a representative from the Big Island. And she was able to polish some of my rough edges and give me some language with which to speak and to examine the question. But that got me involved. And this time around, I figured I'm going to watch again and apply what knowledge I've developed. And while it's not quite as egregious as it was 10 years ago, some of the same problems are emerging. But first, I'd like to, Becky can say hi, and then we'll go into a presentation by the 2 staff people, Dave Rosenbrock, who's the project manager for reapportionment for the state, and who's a very bright IT guy who has worked for the Office of Elections for decades. I know him and I like him, and I want to be clear that all my criticisms, there's nothing personal against him. And the other is Royce Jones, whose background is working with geographic information systems. So they're both data nerds, and they're very competent people. I just think they've got a wrong-headed approach on how to handle reapportionment here. And I'm going to try to say that gently and accurately, providing documentation and legal arguments, with Becky providing much of the legal argumentation. Becky, you want to introduce yourself? Then we'll go to the video.
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, aloha everybody. Great to see you. It's amazing that here we are 10 years later after the 2011 snafu. And I find that I'm talking to Bart quite frequently about some of the same issues that are popping up. So Bart mentioned I was a staff attorney for the late Representative Robert N. Herkes. He was the chair of the CPC committee back in 2011. But this stuff came up like right after session. Reapportionment was like popping up and getting busy, and became sort of apparent that there's some shenanigans happening. And so he assigned me to reapportionment, and I had no idea what reapportionment was. I understand the concept of redistricting, but apportionment was like, what does this mean? So I think that Hawaii uses the term apportionment is really key to our collective understanding of the process that happens here, because we are dealing with multiple islands and this concept of deep ocean between islands, and how sort of as a policy, you know, our framers, our state constitution framers, they wanted to avoid canoe districts where someone's representing multiple islands. So that's a tricky dance, but our reapportionment language in the Constitution and the statutes really outline how we go about it. And as a staff attorney, I got into the archives and I got into legislative history. And as I read through it, it was really clear what the Reapportionment Commission's task was in the process it should have followed. And that's not what was happening in front of my eyes. So at that time in 2011, I was writing up testimonies and researching and just sort of arming you know, stakeholders, particularly Big Island legislators, with you know, what the legislative history and the constitutional history really says. And with that, I just want to note, you know, I think there's a lot of sort of influence and play as to like whether or not, you know, you're patriotic enough, and do you support the military having a vote here, and I think that was like I said, manipulated in a way like, oh, if you don't want to include the military, then you're unpatriotic. And my role was not, you know, and what I want to impart here is like, it has nothing to do about the merit of what the law says. That is within the wisdom of the legislators at that time and what they decided to do. And, you know, so that's what I did. I was looking at the archival history to see this is what was in their heads when they did this, neutral of what my personal feelings are. You know, like, do I want to include it? Do I not include? Like, that doesn't matter. That shouldn't really matter to anybody. We just, our fidelity should be to the process and the black letter law. So that has been my focus. You know, whether or not we want to include the military, that's up to the legislature, you know, to change, and they have that right to do so, or we can, you know, kick it in a, you know, on the ballot at some point. But yeah, so I am here just to talk about what the law says and what the process is and where they went wrong. And I'm going to go through the last case law in Solomon to kind of give you a play-by-play. And I think it'll help us understand what's happening now. And I'm out.
Okay, can we roll the video?
I would like to reintroduce Royce Jones, who is responsible for providing reapportionment, redistricting, mapping, and GIS support services to the Commission. We both have worked with the public, providing access to the same information and mapping resources that you as commissioners will have access to. In 2021, the Commission and the public will have access to online redistricting resources using an application developed by the mapping software company, ESRI. Today, Royce and I will be providing an overview of the two-step process of reapportionment and redistricting in Hawaii. We'll also cover some additional topics. We begin with what is reapportionment and redistricting, why is it done, and who does it. Then we will talk about the U.S. Census population data, how it's reported, and when we expect delivery, and when will it be available to the Commission and the public. We will explain the Hawaii Constitution's requirement in determining two separate population bases. We will then provide information on redistricting guidelines that should be followed when drawing district boundaries. We will conclude with a brief description of the ESRI redistricting online software application. Any questions? I'll now turn it over to Royce Jones.
All right. Thank you, David. Aloha, commissioners, members of the public. We do have some topics to go over here. Introduction, reapportionment, redistricting in Hawaii, what it's all about. So I'll move through the slides here. What it's about at the core is equal representation, both at the federal level, and that's the U.S. House of Representatives. Equal representation is called for in the U.S. Constitution, and at the state level, in the state Senate and the state House, as called for in the Hawaii State Constitution. So what does this mean? To provide equal representation, there's really two steps. The first step is reapportionment. determining how many seats each area gets. At the federal level, that's 50 states, 435 seats in the US House. How are those apportioned among the 50 states? It's based on the census on the population. And then at the state level, we have 4 basic island units. You can see them there on the right-hand side of my screen: Hawaii, Maui, Kauai, and Oahu. So for our state Senate and state House, we apportion those seats among those 4 basic island units. So similar to the way the US House is among 50 states, ours are apportioned among 4 basic island units, and they're all done the same way. It's a method known as the method of equal proportions, and that is called for in the Constitution. So the reapportionment says how many seats, then we need to actually draw the districts with balanced population. So that's the second step, the redistricting step. You can see I've outlined here what that is, both at the federal level and at the state level. So what does this mean? To provide equal representation, there's really 2 steps. The first step is reapportionment, determining how many seats each area gets. At the federal level, that's 50 states, 435 seats in the US House. How are those apportioned among the 50 states? It's based on the census on the population. And then at the state level, we have 4 basic island units. You can see them there on the right-hand side of my screen: Hawaii, Maui, Kauai, and Oahu. So for our state Senate and state House, we apportion those seats among those 4 basic island units. So similar to the way the US House is among 50 states, ours are apportioned among 4 basic island units, and they're all done the same way. It's a method known as the method of equal proportions, and that is called for in the Constitution. But the reapportionment says how many seats, then we need to actually draw the districts with balanced population. So that's the second step, the redistricting step. You can see I've outlined here what that is, both at the federal level and at the state level. Several things to do there. I'll go over them each in a moment. But the end result, what we're trying for, is equal representation. So who does all these things? All right, a lot of steps here. Well, the apportionment of the 435 seats among the 50 states is done by the US Census. Everything else here is the responsibility of the commission, the advisory councils, and the input from the public. So there's a lot of work to do here. We're going to get into a little more detail about them. Where is all this coming from? State Constitution, Article 4 on reapportionment. Some of you have probably looked at that already. That's what calls for this commission to draw districts with balanced population for the US House of Representatives. That's Section 9. Then apportionment within those basic island units. Again, you look, Section 4 has that wording. It calls for the apportionment among the 4 basic island units. It lists them just as I've listed them on my slides, based on the total number of permanent residents in each basic island unit, and it does mention the method known as equal proportions. Once we know how many seats each basic island unit gets, then comes time to draw districts with balanced population. And again, Section 6 of the Hawaii Constitution specifies how that's to be done, such that the average number of permanent residents in each district is nearly equal to the average for the entire basic island unit. As practicable, we'll talk about that word in a moment. And on the Senate, there's an additional section because our state Senate usually has 4-year terms, but because of redistricting, they all got 2-year terms. So to minimize the impact of multiple elections on the resident population of each district, there is a call for the commission to assign 2-year terms to 12 Senate seats, and the other 13 get 4-year terms. And this is based on that resident population within each of the new districts. So we do have this information about the elections in the past so that we can assist the commission in making this determination. So who's actually doing this in 2021? Well, that's also called for in the Hawaii Constitution. I think you all know this by now. Because you are appointed by the President of the Senate, minority leader, Speaker of the House, House Minority Leader, and then the 8 of you chose your 9th member, the chair, Bart. And likewise, as called for in the Constitution, each of the basic island units has 4 members. They have an advisory council with 4 members each. You can see the names up here on the screen of those advisory council members that the commission can call on for input. So with that, that was a quick introduction to reapportionment, redistricting. We're doing it for equal representation. It's called for in the US and the Hawaii Constitution. Any questions from the commissioners before I move on to the next topic? Okay, hearing none. Census data. This is the big question on everyone's mind. We've heard about delays in census data. Well, what is the census data? What do we know about it? Well, it started in 1790 after the Constitution was adopted and required equal representation. So the first census in 1790, and it's been done every 10 years since. I just put in a few numbers of what the total US population was in each of those years. So there it is in 2020, 331,449,281. The census themselves, the census data is used in a number of different ways and reported in a number of different ways. You can see here, each of these different boxes are different ways that this census data is reported and used by various government and non-governmental agencies. You may have heard a couple of different dates for when census data is going to be released. You may have heard end of September. That's when this all of this information will get released in a format for people to use. For our purposes, we really only need these 2 green boxes. We need the state level, which actually has been released, and we need the census blocks, the lowest level, and I'll talk about those in a minute. For our purposes, we just really need these 2, and that's where they'll actually be available in August. Earlier, we don't have to wait for the final one in September, and I'll talk more about that timeline here. But these are the only 2 of all the different things census does. This is what we need. And indeed, the US Census has released statewide population totals. Those came out on April 26th. And that's when the US Census then did the apportionment, and Hawaii maintained its 2 seats in the US House of Representatives, which will then be a responsibility of the commission to draw those districts, those 2 districts with balanced population. The census blocks themselves, there's what they call a legacy format that will be released in mid-August of 2021. So about a month from now, we expect to receive this data, and it's in this quote legacy format, which they have published and we are prepared to use. So we do not need to wait until the end of September. We are prepared as soon as census releases this legacy format data in mid-August to read in our census block population data and start working with it. But what are census blocks? Well, in Hawaii, there are 14,732 census blocks. They're outlined in purple here. They include the Northwest Hawaiian Islands and some areas offshore, but most of them are like you would think of a city block. Most of them are bounded by streets. In fact, in Hawaii, over 80% of those census block boundaries do follow streets. You can see on the left is an area in Honolulu, and each of those purple outlines is a census block, and it's just like you think of a city block. In other areas, you can see on the right-hand side, the area in Hilo, again, most of them just look like you think of a city block, you know, a block surrounded by streets with people living on the block. But there are some areas, the Hilo Municipal Golf Course, you can see there's a boundary there that kind of wavers. That's a stream that cuts through the middle of the golf course. Some of our census block boundaries do follow other features like streams or sometimes ridge lines, particularly up in the more Mauka areas. you get some very interesting shaped census blocks. But nonetheless, every area within the state does have a census block. And every one of those, the census will be reporting, again, in mid-August in the legacy format, what's called the PL 94-171 resident population data. So each one of those 14,000 census blocks, we will be given a number of the resident population as of April 1st, 2020. Some of them will be zero, particularly those offshore ones. Some of them will be in the tens and hundreds. A few of them in the more dense areas could have several thousand people within a single census block. But that is the number that gets reported that we need for our reapportionment and redistricting purposes, is that census block information. So as I mentioned, we expect that in mid-August in the legacy format, and we are prepared to work with that. So what happens then? So in mid-August, we get that census block data, at which point the commission will want to redraw the district boundaries with balanced population, right? Census Bureau has already gone and said, okay, you have 2 seats. They've apportioned it. But this commission does have the responsibility to then draw the boundaries of those districts. So we're ready to support that. As soon as we get that block level data from the census, we're prepared to process that data, get it to ESRI, to ESRI, to load into the online redistricting application. And once that's up, the commission and the public will be able to begin redistricting using the same tool set, using the same data. We anticipate September 1st, 2021. So given that the data comes out mid-August, we get it processed, we get it to ESRI, they get it loaded, we should be ready to actually start drawing plans September 1st. That was the federal side. The state side, there's a few additional steps because as you might recall, I said the words permanent resident population that is called for. Reapportionment within our state Senate and state House is to be used in total number of permanent residents. Likewise, redistricting in section 6 calls for the commission to use the number of permanent residents. So we're better prepared to do this, and the Office of Elections has been working closely with both the military and the universities last year, because we need these numbers as of April 1st, 2020, right? The census numbers are as of April 1st, 2020. We need these same numbers from the military and from the universities as of April 1st, 2020. So the Office of Elections has worked with them. We have those numbers, and that's the numbers you see up on your screen, both the total statewide and by basic island unit. I did put just a map in, since as you saw, most of them are on Oahu. These are the areas where most of the extractions will take place. And perhaps not surprisingly, they're focused around the military bases and the universities. So we are prepared to do this. As soon as that census data comes out, within a day or two, we should be able to have these extractions complete. And at that point, if you want to do redistricting, take your turns. Okay, so here's the extra steps. Just like on the federal side, we'll process that PL 94-171 data. Then we will extract the non-permanent military and students, which gives us then the total permanent resident population for each basic island unit, which allows us to apportion seats. Again, this is nothing the commission needs to decide. It's the method of equal proportions. Once we know the numbers, we will know how many seats each basic island unit gets. We'll pass that information on to ESRI to load into the online redistricting application. And then the commission and the public, just like the federal level, will be able to have the same data, the same tools, begin redistricting. And again, we anticipate September 1st, 2021 to be able to do that. We heard the date of late February to get all of this done. That's all these steps I mentioned, plus a lot of additional steps, right? Because September 1st, hopefully we can start, but then the technical committee or permitted interaction group works on proposed plans. Those plans get presented to the full, and I've shortened out, there's plenty more steps, but just to reinforce it, there's several more steps along the way. The commission will finally adopt a plan, which starts the 20-day notification period. Then the public hearings after those 20 days, any revisions, final adoptions, and the commission files the plan by the chief elections officer. We heard the date, February 27th is the absolute last date. If it can be done sooner, that would be great. If the census data comes out sooner, we are prepared to move on it and get it processed sooner. Because this is the commission's responsibility, ends here, but we're not ready to do an election yet, because there's a process called re-precincting, and there's a process to where the county clerks of both the Big Island and Honolulu have to draw their council boundaries. So similar to this commission drawing the US House, State Senate, and State House, we do have commissions both on the County of Hawaii and the City and County of Honolulu who will be drawing council district boundaries. Once all those district boundaries have been created, at that point, each of our county clerks can assign all registered voters to their new districts, because you need to know, right? Here's the new districts, who lives in which district, which ballot will they get? And at that point, the Office of Elections will need to create the new precincts for managing the elections and reporting results. So there's a number of steps after February 27th. We look forward to helping you get all this done in time. And we will be continuing supporting the clerks in the Office of Elections to carry this process through and be prepared for the 2022 elections and candidate filing, actually, which starts well before the election. So that gives you a little more information on the census data and when we expect it. Any questions from the commissioners on that? On the data itself, on the timelines? Hearing none. All right. There are a number of guidelines for redistricting. I've summarized them here with some sample maps. One of them is that the districts should be compact. And compact can be looked at a couple different ways. The simplest is geometrically compact. Does it look like, you know, a square or a circle, something compact geometrically? In this case, it does. In this case, you can see, yeah, it's starting to kind of look a little bit not so compact. In fact, it's starting to look a little bit like this. You've probably heard the term gerrymander. There was the map of the original gerrymander. It starts to look like you might be favoring a person or a political party, which isn't allowed. So we aim for geometrically compact, but also geographically compact. Geographically compact, this district, which again, I've just made this up for illustration purposes, District 1 looks compact geometrically, but those of you who know the geography on Oahu realize that the ko'olaus divide that in two, and those are two very different geographic areas on each side of that ridgeline. So this would not be considered a compact district. There's another guideline that the districts be contiguous, not disconnected. So here, this is an example of one that is disconnected. That would not be acceptable. Even one-point connections are to be avoided. And then the other thing is submergence. We want to try to preserve socioeconomic communities wherever possible. In fact, that's the words I mentioned before, where practicable, because all of these are guidelines. You didn't see any hard and fast numbers there, although you can put numbers behind some of these things. But they're really, if the plan is challenged and goes before the federal court or the state court, they will be looking at these types of things: compactness, contiguous, submergence, and determining the validity of the plan. There are some specific numbers though, and that is the deviation of population. I mentioned balancing the population within the two districts for the US House. They need to be balanced so that there's less than 1% difference. This is a court-accepted deviation. So we do know our total state population that I mentioned was released back in April by the census. So we know our ideal target population, if we hit it exactly 50-50, each one of our districts would have 727,636 people. Realistically, given the census blocks that you need to draw boundaries around, it's not going to be exactly 50-50, but they need to be within 1% of each other. And actually, ideally, I think it's like 0.87%. But we will, in the online application, you can monitor what that number is. And I'll show you that later as I'm talking about the application. You can see as you're creating a plan, what is the deviation within the plan that you have. So the 1% deviation, that's for federal. For our state Senate and state House, it's a 10% deviation within each basic island unit. I gave you the numbers for the federal. I cannot give you these yet because, as I mentioned before, it relies on the census blocks. We don't have that information till mid-August. But we are prepared as soon as that information comes out in the legacy format. Within a day or two, we should have the total numbers. So we can, using the method of equal proportions, apportion the number of seats for the state Senate and state House within each of the basic island units. And then we will know the ideal target population. Until that time, until we get that census information, we don't know. Extract the non-permanent residents, then we'll be able to give you these numbers. But as I said, we should know within a couple of days of the release of the census. We're prepared to do that. And as I mentioned, the online application from Esri does have a number of these checks. So as you're developing plans, as you're looking at plans, as members of the public are developing plans, we encourage you all to run these tests. In fact, I think a lot of that was in the rules. As I looked through the rules, make sure you run these integrity compactness tests that I mentioned. They're there, they're supported, use them. Any questions on those guidelines from the commissioners? Okay, hearing none, just briefly, the online application itself, it's similar. If you did the online application that we used 10 years ago, the new one has similar tools. It's just slightly different. It's more modernized. It's more up to date. It does have a few more tools that we didn't have available to us. There is a Learn tab, and there'll be a set of learning exercises. We'll be working with you on that to learn what it's all about. You can create districts. You can move census blocks, assign census blocks to different districts. I should mention that. I guess I didn't say that on my map. When you're assigning census blocks, they are the lowest level block. So you're going to assign a census block to either District 1 or District 2, not part of a block, the entire block, right? And so that's what this tool will allow you to do. Say, okay, take this block, put it in District 1. Take this block, put it in District 2. Or outline 10 blocks and put them all in a district. It's got a lot of tools to help you do that efficiently, but it does work at the block level. You can create plans if you want. We'll have several template plans ready to go. And of course, as I mentioned already, review the plans, compactness, integrity, other things. You can generate various different reports. You can export the data. There are other applications that people like to use. You can export the data and consume it in other applications. And this is true of the commissioners and the members of the public. Everyone has access to all these same tools. And then I should mention, there is the Submit tab, because members of the public can submit plans directly to the commission. So they've used the same tool, they've created a plan, they can submit that plan to the commission. And we had this 10 years ago, and I can tell you, I was there, plans were submitted, they were reviewed, lines were changed by the commission based on this public input. It does make a difference. So I encourage members of the public to please do use these same tools, because it really helps the commission if you can provide that information in this format. So that's kind of a quick summary of all these. I think David has an update for us on the ESRI online redistricting, and if there's any other questions from the commissioners, he can take that.
On July 12th, the Reapportionment Project Office met with ESRI to discuss its ongoing preparations to service the Reapportionment Commission. Specifically, ESRI plans to stand up its online redistricting application by the beginning of August and to load it with the 2010 census data. On July 15th, we received notice that the software had been released to us. We expect to complete configuring the software and loading the data by August 1st. We plan to begin training the technical permitted interaction group on using the software as soon as possible after that date. The actual 2020 data is expected, or the 2021 data is expected on August 16th. ESRI expects to have it loaded by the beginning of September. This should give the technical permitted interaction group approximately a month to familiarize itself with the application before beginning with the 2020 census data. We'll keep the Reapportionment Commission up to date on future development and scheduling matters.
I think they gave a pretty good overview of reapportionment for those of you who don't have background. Even those of us that have background, we can get a refresher course in a sense. A lot has happened since that time, though. Let me first touch on a couple of questions people might have. So there is going to be online redistricting software available, not just to commissioners, but to the public. First, they have to approve the population base. And so they are going to be proposing a vote on the population base at the next meeting, which is September 9th. And so it may be as quickly as September 10th. You could go to the Reapportionment Commission's website and you can learn how to set up an account where you can go online and you can get hands-on experience of moving the boundaries around and census blocks to try to create equal populations. Another thing they mentioned, and we're not really focused on that, is the reapportionment and redistricting for the congressional lines, which is also handled by the Reapportionment Commission. They can start that earlier. I believe they're starting it either today or tomorrow, trying to work on the maps, because they're just using the complete census population of usual residents. The US Census is based on that. It's not affected by the state constitutional mandate that it be done on the basis of permanent residents. So they don't have to agree how many non-permanent residents of military and out-of-state students to extract. They have that data. The word is that the current congressional districts with the boundaries now are almost equal in population. They've checked the data. It's about a 0.5%, a 0.5% discrepancy, imbalance between the two districts. What that means is that the line is not going to change very much. It's probably going to be out in Mililani, where they're going to be moving, a couple thousand people from one side of the congressional line to the other. But otherwise, the lines are likely to remain very similar to what they are now. One thing that was mentioned in there in the presentation is the county advisory councils. Now, under Hawaii revised statutes, each county is supposed to have its own advisory council, and those are supposed to be formed at the same time as the State Reapportionment Commission, and they're supposed to begin their work at the same time. But not one meeting has been called. They are waiting on word from the Reapportionment Commission. It was on the agenda at the last meeting, but they never really kick-started them. And I've gone to the minutes from 10 years ago, and already in May, which is the equivalent time now, we're in September 1, but by May, the advisory councils were meeting, and they were asked by the council to opine on the resident population and the extraction of non-residents. And this time they have not been asked, they've not even been put into motion. And I've talked to some members and they're wondering what the heck's going on. And I think it's a valid question. Much of the presentation was very good. Where I take exception, and I think Becky can get into this a little bit more, is about the numbers of proposed extractions. So they start with a census block, and that census data is something they don't have any control over. But then they try to extract non-permanent residents from every census block, and then they go from there and they add together the census blocks that are within each county in order to come up with the overall population of permanent residents in the county. They are fixated on this model, and at some level it makes sense. It's a bookkeeper's dream. You can cross-check. You can say, okay, this is how many are in the census block. We add them all up. That's the same number that is the total number of non-permanent residents, or excuse me, permanent residents in each county. The problem is they're dependent upon getting data from the Department of Defense to identify the active duty personnel and their dependents and whether they are legal residents of the state or not. And so far, they've only gotten about 67.5% of the data on that. So there's this awkward thing that they're saying the individual data is quite good, but there's far too little of it. And they are not getting cooperation from the military, and they don't want us to focus on that. So I have a chart here which I can show you, which shows the difference between what was done last time. If you look at the top of the chart, this is what was done in 2011 and eventually in 2012 after the court ordered them to extract more people. They extracted 95,000 plus non-permanent residents and 13,000 plus non-permanent students, resident students. This time, the number they are proposing based on their inadequate data from the Department of Defense is only extracting 64,000 non-permanent military and 6,000 students. Now, the 6,000 students number, that is justifiable because on April 1st, 2020, we were in the middle of a COVID pandemic, as we are now, but the physical campuses were all shut down. So out-of-state students, it can be understood, may have taken spring break, may not have come back, may have been living at home in their hometowns. It's very likely they were commuting over the over the computer rather than being in state. That makes sense. But there's been no useful explanation as to why they believe the military population is only 2/3 of what it was 10 years ago. And they haven't really even attempted to answer that question. So there was a hint in one article in the Hawaii Herald Tribune that the military population may have declined, and that may be what explains it. Well, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism maintains very good records. They are the authoritative body for state agencies on what is the population of various groups. And if you look at the first red X on the top of the chart, 105,000+ military population in 2010, at the time of that census. And their estimate of the military population this time is only 5,000 less. It is a 5% decline. That goes nowhere near the 32.5% decline that the data that the Apportionment Commission is recommending this time. And people have a right to ask them to explain that. One of the commissioners, Robin Kennedy, actually did ask them at a recent meeting for an explanation, and she got people a little annoyed at her for asking such a question. They told her she was free to try to get the data out of the military herself. But that's something particularly Big Island residents, but also Maui Island residents should be very concerned and be asking for an explanation, because the commissioners are all bound to support the Constitution of the state of Hawaii, as well as they pledged to honor the ruling in the Solomon decision. And if they come out with a plan that believes the military population is only 67.5% of what it was 10 years ago without any basis for it, they are open to a legal challenge and a lawsuit. But let me turn that over to Becky because Becky is skilled and informed on the area of law that deals with reapportionment. Take it over, Becky.
Thanks, Bart. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. And bringing this down from my other screen. Oops. Hold on. Do you see that?
Yeah, but you want to make it whole screen, right?
Okay,
Full screen?
I'm gonna play. Hold on, let's get this play from start. All right, do you guys see like all black here?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so I've got all your faces. I don't want to see your faces. Okay, I do want to see your faces, but okay, here we go. So Solomon v. Abercrombie, that was the court case back in 2011 in response to the 2012, the decision came out, that was the response to the 2011 decision. See if I can use my arrows here. Okay, is that working? So what this decision, this decision I think is really good because it gives sort of a blow by blow of what happened historically, legally with the reapportionment process. And the decision explains that our reapportionment process was originally enacted in 1978 through the CONCON then, and it directed the Reapportionment Commission to quote unquote apportion state legislators based on the number of registered voters every 10 years. So that was the original thought, registered voters. But they determined, the 1991 Reapportionment Commission determined that using registered voters would be unconstitutional. So they decided to remove and extract transients, what they call transients, and hired a research firm to do so back then in 91. And that research firm, and I guess that would be the equivalent of Esri, I don't know if it was Esri, but they noted that the military information was census block identifiable and comprised approximately 14% of Hawaii's population in 1991. So they did have that specific level, census block level data at that time. But it also noted that transient students, as opposed to the military, were statistically insignificant and hard to place within census blocks. So what that did, that 1991 Reapportionment Commission, just to do things constitutionally, so it's not based on registered voters, the 1992 Hawaii State Legislature went ahead and amended the state constitution so it comported with what was constitutionally required. And so instead of registered voters, it made it permanent residents. We're basing our population counts for reapportionment redistricting based on the number of permanent residents. And it all comes from Article 4, Sections 4 and 6. So here's Section 4 at the top, note to permanent residents. And this is among the first step in Section 4. And I think it's significant that the Constitution separates these into two separate, distinct steps. 4, and then something's in 5, and then 6. 4 is about among basic island units and 6 is about within. So I think that's really important. Fast forward, after 1991, we go to the 2001 commission. 2001, relatively, painless. They excluded non-resident military personnel and their dependents and non-resident college students without issue. Fast forward to 2011, and this is where things get interesting. In the start of their process, they initially adopted standards and criteria reiterating that it would exclude non-resident students and non-resident military sponsors. I just noted this is like they didn't, despite what they were doing in the past, they decided to only exclude the sponsors but not the dependents. The commission legal counsel then instructed it that actually it has to exclude the military dependents as well. So this is the first that I see where the corp or the deputy attorney general assigned for the Reapportionment Commission is like, wait, no, you got to follow the law. This is what you're supposed to do. So they tried to just base it on the sponsors, not the dependents, and they were redirected. So then, and this is interesting, the 2011 Reapportionment Commission sought input from the various county advisory councils. And I'm just harking back to the point Bart was making before, that we haven't seen any involvement from the county advisory councils yet. And here we are in September. They were reaching out, way back, maybe over the summer, June, perhaps, Bart, maybe May. So we don't see that now. The 2011 commission was informed by staff, but by removing the non-permanent residents, it had data for, it would result in the transfer of a Senate seat to the Big Island. So that information was very clear. If you take away the non-permanent residents, there's enough there that's going to send a senator to the Big Island. They were aware of that. Thereafter, the commission, after understanding this, voted 8-1 to include non-permanent residents, not to extract. And it resulted in sort of the status quo on the apportionment of senators among the basic island units. So really, the material change of including the non-permanent residents resulted in the status quo, if that makes sense. Okay. So data received from the military in 2011 did not provide specific address location data on the residents. It only included their duty stations. And it didn't indicate whether their military dependents were residents or not. So that commission could not use the process they used in 91 or in 2001, those models that they used and employed by the staff. With that specific census block stuff, because the data coming in was different. So I think it just kind of got frozen. And I note here that census data and looking at the census data at that time was acceptable and was relied upon by the 2011 commission. At the August meeting, and so here we are in September. So I like to, just remind where in the universe we are, like, where would we be today compared to where we were in 2011? So we would have today already had this meeting. And at this meeting, the staff had, quote unquote, operated on the premise that transients needed to be identifiable by their specific residential address. And since they did not have those residential addresses, it created sort of 3 extraction options. So what they were very certain with is that there were 16,000 or so military living in barracks, and maybe there were so many out-of-state students. So they know, okay, 16,458, we know they are transients, they don't live here permanently. That's extraction option A, very certain. Extraction option B was less certain, where we know where the military may or may not be living, but their dependents are on base housing. So that jumped that number up to 73,000 because you got all these families living on base. So we know what census block where those dependents are. So we're adding the dependents. And then even less certain was an extraction, which was 79,000, including students identifiable by zip code and not address. And I think zip code is island specific, county specific. So anyways, that staff had presented the commission with 3 different extraction options based on the level of certainty of their residences. And so what was the vote? How did the commission vote? Well, if you would believe it, 5 of them voted yes, which was a majority, because I guess it was 9 on the commission. 5 voted for the very certain extraction, which was only 16,000. That middle one, the less certain, which would have sent a senator to the Big Island. No one voted that except for the chair at the time, Chair Marks. She said, I actually like extraction B best because there's been about 47,000 military who expressly declared another state their home state. So 73 is closer to 47 than 16,000 is. So I would like to do that. But if she voted for that extraction B, that you wouldn't have had a majority vote to move forward with the process where 4 were already on extraction A. So she decided to vote with the 4 so they could move on. And she expressed this during the meetings. It's like, I'm not comfortable with this, but we gotta move forward. And then even less certain, the 79,000, where we're like, we don't really know where we live, but we know they're not, Hawaii's not their home state, 80,000. No one voted for that. And then 2 commissioners had sort of held fast to this belief that excluding the military, excluding non-permanent residents was unconstitutionally discriminatory. So they were hanging their hat on that, like, let's not do any extraction whatsoever. So they ended up with extraction A, 16,000, no material change to how the legislators are apportioned among the basic island units. So, taking out these 16K, they did this on September 26, 2011. And I remind you, like, here we are, September 1. So they have a plan basically at this point. We're way behind right now. And I know a lot of it's due to the pandemic and the census data being delayed, but this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a very fast tracked process because we have to keep up with the timeline, and it's going to be really easy for things to slide through because it's just happening too fast. So I'm glad everyone here is watching this. So 9/26 is when, September 26 is when they finalize a plan and they file it. And then I think they have like 45 days to challenge it. And then within a couple weeks, we have Malama Solomon, who is a Big Island senator at the time. She goes ahead and she files a lawsuit challenging it. And then Michael Matsukawa, he was from the Big Island also. Is that right, Bart? He files another. And so their argumentation, Solomon is basically saying that you don't need neighborhood census block data, specific data, to do the Article 4, Section 4 off the top extraction, right? That's like Article 4, Section 4, Step 1. And we saw that in the presentation earlier. You don't need that specific census block data to do the off the top extraction. So Solomon explains that. Matsukawa, also has very, very similar arguments. And he's pressing this side, like the idea that the commission was shirking its constitutional duty, bemoaning the difficulty of the task. And, it took action just based out of convenience. So you got these 2 lawsuits that go in right away. And, what the commission response is, in their answers to the complaints, is saying that they did their due diligence by relying on census block certain data. So they seem to really hold fast to this idea. We need the census data block data. And I think that's just because of habit. That's the model they were using before. And I thought it was interesting to note that Governor Abercrombie, who was named as a respondent in the lawsuit, just because of the nature of his position, he files an answer saying, actually, I agree with Solomon. I agree with Matsukawa. The Reapportionment Commission did not do the right thing. The non-permanent residents were not properly extracted. So the Supreme Court didn't take a lot of time to come up with a per curiam decision. And per curiam means, like, when you hear about Supreme Court decisions, like so-and-so is writing for the court and you have someone concurring or dissenting or whatever, like they don't even bother with any of that. It's just like the whole court is saying in one unified voice, you screwed it up. You did it wrong. You did not follow the law. And you need to throw it out and redo it and refile it. And the key points that the court made was that reapportionment is a 2-step process. And that's clear just from the way that the Constitution's laid out. Article 4, Section 4, Article 4, Section 6. Step 1, Step 2. 4 is among, and 6 is within. So census block specific info was not needed for Step 1. So the rest of my presentation, I'm not going to read all of it, and I could PDF and send this to you guys if you want to look. But for the next several slides, I extracted some really key language from the opinion that basically lays it out for the commission. Like, you really have to go Step 1 and Step 2, and relying on Step 2 census specific data to do the apportionment within an island unit isn't necessary. That level of certainty isn't necessary to do Step 1 which is take it off the top, extract all the non-permanent residents from the top, and then you know how to apportion amongst the basic island units. Once you're there, then the census data specific information is relevant. But just because you don't have perfect data to do a perfect step 2 doesn't mean you can't do a really good step 1. And so that was, to me, that was really clear. And, you know, you can just sort of see here, I'm just going to slowly scroll through these, and I highlighted in yellow some of the key words. Among, we need to look at among the basic island units as step 1. Section 4 expressly mandates that only permanent residents be counted in the population base. And it's for the among, which is step 1. Among step 1, then we do 2. So whatever happens, you know, your data, the processes that's relevant to 2, it doesn't matter until you take care of step 1. More 2-step process. I mean, this is all like laid out. They hit them with this point, paragraph after paragraph. 2-step process. Among, followed by apportionment within. It first requires this. Among, we allocate the legislators, and then we apportion districts therein. This, I think, is really significant, this language. It's a process of allocating numbers of representatives or senators to various districts within the state. It's a process of making those districts. These are quite different activities. Step 1 and step 2 are quite different activities. More, step 1, among, step 2, within. Step 1, determine the total number of permanent residents in the states. And then you go to, as the initial step, to determine the total number of permanent residents in the state and in each county. I mean, they really hit us over the head with this. Step 1, extract non-permanent military residents and non-permanent university students from the states and counties 2010 census population. And then in step 2, identify the specific locations. This is very significant. Identification of the residence addresses for the non-permanent residents was necessary for apportionment of the Senate and House members within the county districts under step 2, but was not necessary for allocation of the Senate and House members among the 4 counties under step 1. I don't know how many more times they need to say it, but the commission had sufficient data to determine the non-permanent military resident populations of each of the county. It had the data to determine by the site of the universities where the non-permanent student resident populations of each of the counties. So they had enough data. Nothing in Article 4, Section 4 requires apportionment based on the total number of permanent residents identified by census block. So this is another really clear indication. The census specific data isn't necessary for step 1, and you can't get to step 2 until you do step 1. More, again, step 1, among, step 2, within. Just a few more slides. The commission undertook its reapportionment task by focusing solely on identification of non-permanent residents for step 2 and using the results for step 2 to identify the non-permanent resident population for step 1. Again, they put the cart before the horse. They didn't do it right. Final reapportionment plan disregards the express mandate of Article 4, Section 4, Step 1, that only permanent residents be counted in the population. And this is the final slide. The commission must, and this is the direction, must first determine the total number of permanent residents in the state and each county and use those numbers to allocate the legislators among the 4 counties. And upon, and this indicates this is the next step, upon such allocation, the commission must then do the districting within each of the counties. And that's it. So, and what I didn't add to this slide, but I think, or this PowerPoint, which is also significant, is Senator Laura Ocasio. She had asked for an opinion from the Attorney General's office on Act 14 passed recently that sort of speaks to from this last session, that sort of speaks to the process and when to do it, but it was really confusing the way the act finally came out because it was like brand new during conference. There wasn't really much any discussion of this during the legislative process. It just popped up during conference, buried into a bill that had some other really important things. I think it was about paying the legislators. Was that what it was, Bart? So it passed, but it was sort of new. And so a senator had asked for an opinion to clarify, and the AG's opinion clarified, consistent with Solomon, is that there's a two-step process and you can't mix up what you need for step 2 and use it for doing what's in step 1. So hopefully that's like pretty clear as day, because to me it's clear as day, but it seems like when you listen to the Reapportionment Commission meetings, they're confused and they're stuck on 2 and really want that census data. And I think the more all of us understand, the more we can ask educated questions and probe them. I also want to reiterate the point that Bart said, is like, why do we need to rely on the military's profession of the data, like, oh, this is what we say it is, when we have DBED and US Census data that's giving us very different figures, and it really sort of comports with what we've seen, sort of the rates and the trends and proportions from the last 10 years. A 5% difference is very different from the number that the military gave us, which is 67% of what DBED gives us, and pretty close to that from what the number was 10 years ago and all along. And with that, I'll conclude.
Okay, but let me just try to be real brief, and then we can go to questions. I just want to share another chart to sort of show. These are the extraction figures that they were dealing with in 2011. Becky alluded to them. I've included the 4th column in blue there on the right. So the current extraction they're doing is sort of proposing now is sort of in the neighborhood of extraction B. It was not until they developed a plan, went to the Supreme Court ordered them to redo it, rejected their plan, that they were able to go back to the military and ask for more data, and using the Senate office, probably Senator Inouye, who had requested the military cooperate and give them more data, then they were able to get census block specific enough numbers for the entire population, and it jumped up to 106,000. Now, David Rosenbrock, who's in charge of this process, has said in hearings that they're having a hard time getting cooperation from the military. They can ask for the numbers, but all they get is what they get. And yet he refuses to see that and he says, we had a bigger club in those days because we had Inouye and we had the Supreme Court ruling. So he's basically admitting that we're not going to get the complete numbers unless and until there's a lawsuit, and then our senators get involved and request their cooperation. So that's admitting that the methodology to which they are attached is not appropriate for what's going on. Now, as I read Solomon, not only did they confuse the 2 steps, there is no requirement that the 2 totals of permanent residents be the same number. They have to use the best data available to them as practicable for the task in front of them. And the task of apportioning legislative seats between the 4 basic island units, the 4 counties, can be satisfied by taking the complete military population. They've already determined that 99%, people should be aware of this, 99% of the active duty military have filed written declarations that they are legal residents of other states, not Hawaii. This is their self-determination. This is their self-declaration. This is not us imposing anything on them. We are honoring the fact they say that they are not citizens of the state of Hawaii, but citizens of other states. And therefore it is appropriate in our court rulings and our judicial process to not include them in the population count. So we can use the total number multiply that by 99%. We can easily figure out how many military are assigned to Kauai, to Maui, and to Hawaii County, and then we can deduct those, and the other 98, 99% are live on Oahu and can be extracted. We will come out with a much closer number on how many non-permanent residents there are, then depending upon and begging the Department of Defense to give us piecemeal, small dribble and drabble of their data when it clearly is only about 2/3 of the total number. So that is the approach that they could use, but instead they are fixated on having census block specific numbers for the step one apportionment thing. And they are violating Solomon in my mind, and they're vulnerable to a lawsuit. That will cause delay. If they're worried about time constraint, there's never enough time to do the job right, but there's always time to do it over. So with that, I'm open for questions.
You said that in 2011, they got assistance from Senator Inouye to get the data from the military. Why is it not possible now to go to one of our senators, let them know there is a problem and ask them for assistance?
I'm not involved in those communications. I guess I could call one of the senators as an individual. The commission could be, there are communications between staff and the staff of the commission and the staff of the Senate offices. I don't know which senator is taking the lead on this. It's a different situation in 2012 though, because I don't believe that Senator Inouye was actively involved in the process early on. It was only, my understanding is it was only after the Supreme Court said, you guys got, these numbers are no good. You have to come up with a new plan, that created an emergency. And I believe that's when Senator Inouye requested the military cooperate more, and they came up with additional data, which then David Rosenbrock and Royce were able to process and identify a total of 108,000 to extract. So,
well, I guess that's my
there's
point.
an emergency, I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, and that's my point. We have this history. I know you're the wrong person to talk to. It should talk to the commission, but it seemed logical to me that if there is a problem now, speak to our elected officials, talk to them for assistance if we're concerned. And by we, I mean the commission. To me, it just seemed logical that's what they should be doing.
Bart and Becky, if I could ask something. When I look at the Solomon decision, it seems to me that what they were really, one of the big things they were dinging the commission for, in addition to, as Becky pointed out, disregarding the two-step nature of the process, is they said that the military provided numbers that the commission then disregarded because they didn't think they were good enough. And when I look at the numbers in the Solomon decision, it looks like just about 106,000 were that was what the military provided the first go around. So I guess one observation is that it seems to me what the commission is doing this time, in one sense, is using the numbers that the Supreme Court suggested they use in 2011, PACOM military numbers. But then Bart and Becky, you seem to suggest that there's this going back to the military to get better data, but that better data seemed to produce this 106,000 number, which is almost exactly the same number that the military provided the first time around, as far as I can tell, from the Solomon decision. So I'm not sure what this better data was the second time around after the Supreme Court's decision.
Oh,
I'm sorry if that's not.
Yeah, the better data was they actually gave them more census block specific information for the members, where they didn't do that in sufficient numbers before. So that's why they were complaining early on in the deliberations of the commission. We don't have census block specific enough numbers, and we are bound by this notion that we have to have census block specific numbers for both extractions in step one and step two. And therefore, we only have these 16,000 people that we have census block specific data and can withdraw. So you're right that the military did give them a large number. I think it was 120 something thousand military that somehow the military regarded as non-permanent residents, but they didn't provide specific enough data to satisfy the criteria that the commission staff had decided were necessary in order to withdraw. And then when they presented it to the commission took ownership and adopted a plan based on that. Now, at this point, the commission has not yet taken a stand, so I'm blaming the staff for proposing a similar sort of process as last time. They are again insisting it has to be census block specific, both for the extraction, for apportionment in step 1 and for the redistricting within the basic county units in step 2. And that is a methodology that's getting nowhere. They have complimented, they have said the data is better this time than initially it was in 2011, which simply means to me that now they are getting, 64,000 military with census block specific information, whereas they didn't have anywhere near that amount. They had, 10,000, 15,000, whatever, that was census block specific enough early on in the 2011 process. But even if so they're saying that they're not going to be able to get enough of the census block specific information to satisfy them in order to make a bigger extraction, unless they have a bigger club like they had in 2012 after the Supreme Court ordered them to go back. And then the Senator Inouye got involved. I don't know if Senator Schatz or Mazie Hirono, both of whom I have great respect for, if they are as large a club as Senator Inouye ever was.
We're coming up on 8 o'clock, so we are going to stop recording, but we will keep the Zoom open so we can continue with questions. All right. And thank everybody for coming.